Welcome to this video about budgeting in the United States. In this video, we are going to cover the following topics. First, we are going to talk about budget function classifications. Next, we are going over the federal budget process and the major institutions that are involved in this process. We move on to federal budget laws and the budget cycle. The last two topics cover types of budget authority and present main social insurance programs. Note there is also a link to an infographic titled The Federal Government's Budget Process. The first topic is going to be budget function classification. A function is the categorization of federal spending according to a purpose or mission. The report from the Government Accountability Office, titled Budget Function Classification, outlines the various functions of the government. Those functions are not equal to administrative departments. For example, you can have a function which is the responsibility of multiple departments. An example for this is the function National Defense, located within the Department of Defense as well as the Department of Energy. You can also have one department and multiple functions. For example, the Department of Defense is responsible for national security, but due to its large assets in terms of land area on military bases, also executes functions related to natural resources and the environment. In some budgets and budget reports, you may find data categorized by function and subfunction as opposed to department or agencies. There are a total of 20 functions. 17 of them are characterized as broad areas of national need, whereas the 3 remaining functions cover miscellaneous items such as interest payments associated with the federal debt. Budget resolutions, a topic which we are going to cover in detail later in the video, but can be thought of as an agreement between the House and the Senate on a budget plan, are structured around the functions. Here I have listed 3 functions as an example. We have community and regional development, and the subfunctions associated with that broad function are community development, area and regional development, and disaster relief and insurance. The function energy has 4 subfunctions, which are energy supply, energy conservation, emergency energy preparedness, and energy information, policy and regulation. Now, let us next look at the federal budget process and the major institutions involved in determining the federal budget. There are many offices and agencies and departments involved in the construction of the federal budget. We have the executive branches that report to the White House, such as the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB. We have legislative branch offices that are reporting to Congress. Those offices are the Congressional Budget Office, CBO, the Government Accountability Office, GAO, and the Congressional Research Service, CRS. Of course, we have a multitude of federal departments, such as the Department of Agriculture, the Department of Defense, or the Department of Energy. There are also federal agencies involved in the budget process as well, such as, for example, the CIA, the Environmental Protection Agency, FEMA, NASA, and so on. Those federal agencies and departments are submitting budget requests to be funded for the next fiscal years. The Office of Management and Budget is an executive branch office that organizes the President's budget. It sets the funding priorities according to the President's policies, but also evaluates the effectiveness of agency programs, policies, and procedures in achieving the objectives set by the White House. The OMB also assesses the competing funding requests from agencies and departments. The OMB is responsible to calculate what is called the current services estimate. This is a spending baseline reflecting current services and status quo policies and programs. The current services estimate can then be used to assess the effects of changes in policy on the budget. The advantage of the current services estimate is that if the President is proposing policy changes, then the effects can be compared to the current services estimate. The OMB is also responsible to submit the President's annual budget and supporting material to Congress. In addition to preparing the President's budget, the OMB supervises and coordinates the administration's procurement and financial management, among other items. It is also tasked with improving the administrative management and developing performance measures. The Congressional Budget Office, or CBO, provides nonpartisan budgetary information and analysis to Congress. You will see that a lot of the information provided in the lectures and videos come from the CBO. Among the various tasks of the CBO is an annual economic forecast or budget baseline projection. Usually at the request of members of Congress, it conducts financial analysis on specific topics. It also evaluates spending and revenue options to reduce the budget deficit or the federal debt. I recommend having a look at the various reports and publications of the CBO, since those could be of interest to you. Let us now move on to major federal laws. Article 1 of the US Constitution states that no money shall be drawn from the Treasury, but in consequence of appropriations made by law, and a regular statement and account of the receipts and expenditures of all public money shall be published from time to time. One important term in this article is appropriations, which basically means funds devoted to a specific purpose. And those appropriations are made by lawmakers, that is, the US Congress. We covered the exact mechanism of the term later in this video. We will see that over the decades, various acts have been implemented to restrict budget deficits and federal debt. The earliest attempt is the Anti-Deficiency Act, with the first version from 1870. The act prohibits departments from spending more money than appropriated by Congress. We have important budget acts in 1921 as well as in 1974. For example, the Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 creates the Bureau of Budget, which is now the OMB, as well as the Government Accountability Office. It also established the start of the fiscal year on July 1. This will later be changed by the Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 to October 1. The Budget and Accounting Act of 1921 also establishes a national budget system and requires the independent audit of government accounts. The Congressional Budget and Impoundment Control Act of 1974 establishes the House and Senate budget committees as well as the Congressional Budget Office. It also introduces the functional classifications in the President's budget that we talked about earlier in this video. It also introduces the concepts of rescission and deferrals instead of impoundments. The meaning of those terms will be explained in the next slide. Impoundment is basically the decision of the President to withdraw funds. Note that this has been replaced by rescission, which means that there is a proposal by the President to withdraw funds, and then this proposal requires to be approved by a majority vote by Congress within 45 days. Basically, the rescission, as opposed to the impoundment, restricts the power of the President to withdraw funds. There is also the concept of deferral, which means a temporary delay in the release of funds for obligation. Note that this deferral can be delayed to a maximum of the end of the fiscal year. There are also other acts. Next, we have the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1984. Note that there is one part of the Act which is also called the Gramm-Rudman-Hollings Act. The purpose is that deficit targets should be established to balance the budget by 1991. The mechanism aimed at establishing the deficit targets is by means of sequestration. Basically, what sequestration means is that there are provisions in the Act that impose automatic spending cuts, sequestration, if total discretionary appropriations exceed budget spending thresholds. Those automatic triggers cut expenditures across all departments and programs by an equal percentage. Note that the original version was actually ruled unconstitutional by the Supreme Court because it violates the Constitution's command that Congress play no direct role in the execution of laws. Next, we have the Budget Enforcement Act, which is part of the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act of 1990. Here again, it is a replacement of the Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act of 1987, and it imposes upper limits on discretionary spending. This act expired in 2002. However, it also implemented pay-as-you-go rules. Pay-as-you-go basically means that current expenditures for any program are paid with current revenue from that program. This implementation of the pay-as-you-go rules has been implemented for entitlement and taxes. In addition, it requires that any changes to be deficit neutral or deficit reducing. There are also various acts after 2010. For example, there's the Statutory Pay-as-you-go Act of 2010, which prevents new tax cuts or entitlement spending legislation to increase budget deficits. There is also the Budget Control Act of 2011, which reintroduces discretionary spending limits with sequestration. It also includes an amendment to balance the budget. There are also the bipartisan budget acts of 2013 and 2014 that relax the upper limits imposed by the Budget Control Act of 2011 due to excessive restrictiveness. You can see that many of those acts aim at balancing the budget, reducing the deficit, and hence reducing the federal debt. At the end of this video, we are going to talk about the effects of having too much federal debt and what it does to economic growth. The next topic that we are going to look at is the budget cycle. The timetable can basically be subdivided into 6 steps. Remember that the start of the fiscal year is on October 1st. So everything that needs to happen in terms of appropriation bills and budget design has to happen before. No later than the first Monday in February, and this is the first step, the President has to submit the budget to Congress. The next step is that we are drafting a budget resolution. Remember that the budget resolution is basically a general plan by the House and the Senate of how the budget should look like. Once this is done, we are moving to the third step, which is the drafting of the appropriation bills by the House and by the Senate. The next step involves reconciliation, which means that any discrepancies between what the House thinks the appropriation bills should look like and the Senate, that those discrepancies are solved. Next, we have the appropriations by the House, or the appropriation laws are by the House. And then ultimately, we have the signature of those laws in order for them to be in effect by the President. Once all of those steps is done, the fiscal year can begin. In terms of the President's budget request, the steps are basically threefold. First, we have an outline of the President's overall fiscal policies to Congress. Here, the President or the White House outlines the spending, the tax revenue, as well as deficit and surplus spending. It also outlines the President's relative priorities for federal programs for the next 5 years. For example, how much should be spent on defense, how much should be spent on agriculture or education. It also includes recommendations of spending and tax policy changes. Note that all those documents are compiled by the OMB. Next, we have the Congressional Budget Resolution. The Congressional Budget Office explanation of the Congressional Budget Resolution states that it is basically a blueprint to guide congressional action on budget-related legislation over the course of the year. It does not provide funding for federal programs or change tax law. Rather, it sets overall spending and revenue targets, sometimes for as many as 10 years. A budget resolution is not law because it is not signed by the President. It takes effect if approved by both houses of Congress. The budget resolution also includes spending ceilings for the 20 budget functions that we have talked about before. We have a draft of the House and Senate Budget Committee's budget resolution, and there is also floor voting in the House and the Senate, and amendments can be made by majority vote. Any differences between the Senate and the House resolutions are then moved to conference committees, where those differences are solved. Note that the budget resolution cannot be filibustered. Budget resolutions should usually pass by April 1. If a budget resolution is not passed by that date, it is the resolution from the previous year that remains in effect. There are also mechanisms to encourage or force budget resolutions. So, for example, there's the enforcement to produce spending cuts or tax increases called for in the budget resolution by a specific date. There are also instructions to reconciliate. Now, a very important aspect of the federal budget cycle are the so-called appropriation bills, which are basically laws that allow spending of federal funds. Those annual appropriation bills are for discretionary funding only. We are going to talk about the difference between discretionary funding and mandatory funding later in this video. Annual appropriation bills become law once the President signs them. Note that the passage of appropriation bills is easier said than done. Most fiscal years start without all appropriation bills passed. Between 1977 and 2008, bills passed on time only in 4 years. In 2008, only one appropriation bill passed, with the remaining bills rolled together in a single appropriation. In some fiscal years, no appropriation bills passed at all. Closely linked to appropriations are so-called appropriation accounts. Appropriation accounts are a framework for expenditure control. Recall from the Article 1 of the US Constitution that Congress basically has the congressional power of the purse, in the sense that without appropriation bills, money cannot be spent. That power is enforced through appropriation accounts. Those appropriation accounts are the primary mechanism for Congress to allocate funds to programs. They are the building blocks for agencies to prepare budget requests, and it is also the basic unit in agencies' internal control system to keep spending within what Congress has approved. Those appropriation accounts are also subject to regular reports and auditing. Next, we are going to talk about types of budget authority. Budget authority is basically the authority provided by law to enter into obligations resulting in immediate or future outlays involving federal government funds. Think about a government agency that has the budget authority over funds. It basically means that they are allowed to spend the funds and enter into contracts. There are various forms of budget authority. There are appropriations, there's the authority to borrow, and there's also the contract authority. The most common form of budget authority are appropriations. It is the provision of funds for the upcoming year as a result of the legislative phase of the budget process, that is, the Appropriation Bill. The Appropriation Act as a statute providing authorization for federal agencies to incur obligations and make payments. This is the most common mean of providing budget authority. The two other forms of budget authority are the authority to borrow and the authority to contract. Both are relatively self-explanatory in the sense that the authority to borrow means that you have the authority to borrow funds, and the contract authority is the authority to provided by law to enter into contracts. We are going to see in the upcoming slides the difference between discretionary spending and mandatory spending. Before, I said that appropriation bills are only meant to allow for discretionary spending. Some programs are not covered by appropriation acts, in the sense that they are not required to go through the appropriation process. Usually the spending is determined by formula or eligibility requirements. This is what mandatory spending is. Examples are Medicare, Social Security, or also veterans benefits. The eligibility criteria is established by law. Let us now talk about discretionary and mandatory spending. Note that mandatory spending has come under significant scrutiny over the last decades. Now, let us first have a look at discretionary spending. When we talked about the federal budget cycle and appropriation bills, then all those bills and acts related to discretionary spending. Discretionary spending flows through the annual appropriation process with the possibility to adjust the spending from year to year. Note that discretionary spending has decreased from approximately 74% of total outlays in 1962 to 26% in 2022. Mandatory spending has increased over that same period. Basically, if you're thinking about the reverse numbers here, in the sense that mandatory spending increased from 26% in total outlays in 62 to 74% in 2022. Mandatory spending does not go through the regular appropriation process, and basically spending is controlled by an autopilot, if you will, in the sense that you have programs, and if people become eligible to receive funds from that program, then this does not have to go through any process or appropriation. There are usually two types of eligibility criteria, and those are either means tested versus non-means tested. Means tested means that the assistance depends on the economic status of the recipient. That means if we have a recipient that is of low income or that falls below a certain threshold, then the recipient is eligible for assistance. Now think about what this means in terms if we have a financial crisis, for example, or if we have the COVID-19 pandemic, where we suddenly have very high unemployment rates, or where we have an economic downturn. What this means is that more and more people are requesting unemployment benefits as well as Medicaid. Those spendings, since they are based on eligibility and a formula, they are not controlled during the appropriation process. There can also be non-means tested eligibility, and this is if the recipient has a certain demographic or other eligibility criteria that is not related to the economic status. Here, the most common one is age. So if you're over the age of 65, for example, then you are eligible for Medicare. Now this graph shows what I have presented previously, in the sense that in 1962, the percent of mandatory spending as a share of total spending was about 26%. And this has increased to 74% by 2020. Now, let us look at those main social insurance programs related to mandatory spending. There are two trust funds in the old age survivors and disability insurance. Note that the old age survivors and disability insurance is commonly known as Social Security. On one hand, we have the old age and survivors insurance, which basically covers retired workers and the dependents of retired workers, as well as survivors of deceased workers. The second trust fund is the disability insurance, which covers disabled workers and the dependents of disabled workers. Note that the financing of this trust fund is financed by earmarked payroll taxes. The next social insurance program is so-called Medicare. Here we have multiple parts. So Part A, or the hospital insurance, is financed by earmarked payroll taxes. Then we have Part B and Part D, which pays for medical care as well as for medication. Those funds or those expenses are usually financed with a premium and mostly through general fund revenue. Note that over the last decades, this Part B and D has increased in cost significantly, which is also one of the reasons for the increase in the share which you have seen in the previous graph. We also have Part C, which is basically a combination of Part A and B, in the sense that it is a combination of the hospital insurance trust and the supplemental medical insurance trust funds. The third big program is Medicaid. Medicaid is basically medical care for low-income individuals. It is not associated with any trust fund, but it is a joint federal and state program, in the sense that 1% of matching funds are received from the government for every $1 a state spends. Note that those spending is usually higher in poorer states. On average, the federal government covers about 57% of Medicaid costs across all states. As we have seen before, the share of mandatory spending has increased significantly. There are many problems associated with financing Social Security. Until the mid-1980s, it was handled as a pay-as-you-go, in the sense that premiums collected this year also covered benefits paid this year. The problem is that we have a falling ratio of workers to beneficiaries, in the sense that benefit payouts exceed the payments. The reason for this falling ratio of workers to beneficiaries is that we have low birth rates, we have a retirement of baby boomers, and we also have low death rates. In 1960, when those programs were designed, we had 5 workers for each recipient. It is projected that that ratio is going to 2 workers for 1 beneficiary by 2030. As I mentioned before, we have also seen an increase in the healthcare cost. One possible solution would be what is called actuarial funding, in the sense that a worker would pay into a fund during the working years and then receive the principal plus interest upon retirement. Now, to illustrate the concept that I talked about before of the falling ratio of workers to beneficiaries, here I have a graph which depicts the population of age 65 and over in various countries. You can see that for most countries in the 1960s, that share of the total population age 65 and over was below 10% for many countries. But this has significantly increased by 2020. You can see, for example, for Japan, it has increased from approximately 6% in 1960 to over 30% in 2022. Also, in the US, it has increased significantly over time. Now, coming back to the actuarial funding of Social Security programs. As I have mentioned before, what it would do, it would establish a trust fund in which workers pay in during their working years and then receive the principal and interest when they are retirement. Those investments in the funds could be then put into secured investment vehicles, for example, US government securities, in order to compound interest over time. Now, the actuarial funding would be possible, for example, for Social Security or Medicare, because there is a predictable cycle of work following retirement. Because remember that Social Security and Medicare are based on age. You are receiving both if you are over the age of 65 in general. However, this funding model is not possible for Medicaid, because it is not a predictable cycle between prosperity and poverty. Now, the last topic which I would like to cover is the federal debt. We have seen in this video that many acts over the last decades have attempted to reduce the annual deficit in order to get a control of the debt. There are problems associated with having a federal debt. Basically, it threatens long-term economic growth due to the fact that financial resources, are taken out of the capital market and are not allocated to productive use, for example, loans to firms. Because now, funds from the capital market are actually used to pay interest. Sometimes those interests also go to foreign investors. Having a high federal debt also constrains the response to important issues such as a financial crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic. The last point here is not really an issue for countries like the United States or the European Union or regions like the European Union, that a high debt can also lead to inflation in case the debt is monetized, in the sense that there is more money printed by the central bank in order to finance the debt. Usually in countries like the US or in regions like the European Union, and also in many other developed nations, there is an independence between the government and the central bank to avoid debt monetization.